Hi people of the internet and welcome to this new video by the Rerum Natura. Today we are going to discuss about one question that many people usually want to argue about, which is history science? With Without further ado, let's dive just deep straight into the point. So I think that the most natural question to start this discussion with is what is science? And turns out this is on its own a crazy complex question that probably deserves and maybe shall have in the future its own video. This said, I think there's no doubt that we can simplify the question by simply stating that there are many different ways to think of science. Science is not like, an apple, which is one thing for everyone in the same way, which it really isn't, but that's for another time. Science is a word that can mean lots of different things depending to whom you ask. Now, probably a contemporary scientist would tell you something like science is that discipline, that subject that uses the scientific method, which is a reasonable definition, even though not really amazing. This definition is clearly the definition a naturalist would give us, someone who studies nature, like a physicist or a biologist. They do all the research on nature, and doing the research on nature, they work just empirically, and in doing so, they use a strict methodology that we call the scientific method, even though we probably shouldn't, because the phrase scientific method really describes a lot of different approaches we have had throughout history to do science, which are very different among them. For example, the way Galileo Galilei did science, has methodology wise very little to do with the way modern scientists do that, but we call both things the scientific method. And to be fair, that's even worse because when you go to a school, they show you the way Galileo worked and tell you that's the way modern scientists work today too, which is so false. But and that's another story for another time. So if we want, obviously, if I want to tell you that science is what uses the scientific method, and that the scientific method is really just one of two things: the way Galileo did science, or the way a modern physicist does science. If I were to tell you that, history would not be a science. And in history, you do not really do experiments in a laboratory, right? But I think that definition of science is very underwhelming. Well, maybe not very, but that's underwhelming, and no one can deny that for two reasons mainly. Maybe there are more, but I'm gonna tell you two. First, that definition doesn't actually work. If you're a mathematician, you are very used to textbooks which give you the definition, like, that's the definition, that's the starting point, and from there, they derive more stuff. But that's not really how science works, that's not really how logic works, and to be fair, that's not even how maths works, because no mathematician whatsoever ever begins with definitions. Definition is almost always the end. You just think about what you need to solve this problem, you make it up, and once you made it up, you write a definition for it. But that's like the end of the process. In real life, when we give a definition to something, we already have an intuitive idea of what that something is, and from there we try to work with that intuitive idea, and if we really find it ambiguous, we try to make a definition which is clear, unambiguous, and manages to capture our intuitive idea of the thing, which is not always possible. That's the reason why you can make a discussion about what is freedom or what is science, like we're doing right now, and start the discussion, write a title, decide to make a YouTube video about the discussion before you actually start talking about what the definition is. I didn't need a definition of science to decide to make a video about whether history is a science or not, did I? So, why did I tell you this? For the simple reason that a definition is a decent definition, not only if it's unambiguous and everything, it's a good definition if, when you apply that, what we think of as corresponding to said definition matches the definition. If you have an intuitive idea of an apple and you make a definition for apple, but that definition does not include what things that you consider apples, like green apples, then your definition is not good. Maybe it's useful, maybe you can do something with that, but that's not particularly good. The same applies for science. Does cosmology work with scientific method? Well, not really. Does anthropology or sociology work with scientific method? No, absolutely not. And there are people who would tell you that's because they ain't sciences. And those people, in my opinion, would be absolutely wrong. Cosmology is a science that is so deeply related with physics that you can't, and astronomy, which are clearly sciences, that you just can't deny it's science. They're just too similar, too related. It's even hard to distinguish astronomy, physics, and cosmology when they all work together. But a cosmologist doesn't really use the scientific method as like a physicist would, and neither does an anthropologist, not in the stricter sense of words, but still. Anthropology is a science. There are people who deny that, but those are naturalists that do not understand that anthropology and sociology work like sciences. They use math, they use statistics, they have huge blackboards filled with numbers and Greek letters. That's science, okay? And here you might ask me, is math science? I didn't answer you. I just made a video about math earlier on, so I'm not going to talk about that because we gotta go straight to the point. And the answer is still, it depends on how you define science. But it still drives me deep where I want to go, because there is another way to talk about science, which is the way a lot of like old philosophers, and by old I mean like 18th century, something like that. And that way of thinking about science is the following. You think of science as something that is rational and builds up concepts, understanding, ideas, starting using reason, using logic, using intellect in a purely and absolutely rational way, starting from what you already knew. So some people, like Immanuel Kant, would define science like shit a priori, you think about that, you know more shit. That's science, and you do it rationally. You only use reason. That's science. And in fact, and that's interesting, because this definition is very similar, but not quite the same, of another definition that other people use and locate in more or less the same period, and maybe they live together in the same place and the same time frame, but they're actually different. Other people, like a philosophy professor of mine, used to implicitly define science as, it wasn't really explicit, but that was clearly the way he meant the term, as whatever gives you actual understanding of the object. Does religion give you any actual understanding of anything? No. So it is not science. Does physics do that? Even in a Kantian Kantian museology framework, yeah, it does. It tells you something, not about the object in itself, about its phenomenon, but that's still telling you something. So physics does. And so physics is a science. These two definitions come to clash in a pretty interesting way, because if you may say that as long as you think rationally, you end up knowing actual stuff about things, and so the definitions are these last two definitions are actually the same. But that's not true, because sometimes you are just wandering off the limits of your neurological model, and so even though you think rationally, you go nowhere, which is the case of more or less, I'm simplifying a little bit here, but that still holds, of Kantian metaphysics. Well, not really all Kantian metaphysics, that is too much of a broad term, but the stuff you find in the transcendental dialectic, right? So Kantian theory of reason, Kantian upper metaphysics, Kantian theory on ideas. Okay, that's the term. Kantian theory on ideas is a theory that admits that it tells you nothing about actual things. And so, according to the last definitions we have given, it's just a theory about ideas, which ain't things, according to Kant. So, according to the last definition we have given, that's not a science. And that's the reason why that philosophy professor of mine said that all of the critical pure reason can be synthesized in the sentence, metaphysics is not science to Kant, which probably sounds stupid to you, but that is just what happens when you think of science as according to the last definition. If we were talking according to the second definition, which is the one I think Kant would have probably given to you, it would be different. In that framework, science could be considered as metaphysics. In that concept, in that framework, metaphysics could be considered as science according to Kant, and in fact, it probably was. Kant called metaphysics a science, and which makes that thing my professor said sound very weird, but it isn't, because those are just two distinct and equally valid definitions of science. To dive a little bit deeper into the second definition I've given, I'm gonna read you a quote from the Goethe himself, which is obviously Immanuel Kant, on which he says, "I maintain that in every special natural doctrine, only so much science proper is to be met with as mathematics. For science proper, especially of nature, requires a pure portion lying at the foundation of the empirical and based upon a priori knowledge of natural things. To the possibility of a determinate natural thing, and therefore to cognize it a priori, is further requisite that the intuition corresponding a priori to the conception should be given. In other words, that the conception should be constructed. But the cognition of the reason to construction of conceptions is mathematical. A pure philosophy of nature in general, namely one that only investigates what constitutes a nature in general, may thus be possible without mathematics. But a pure doctrine of nature, respecting determinate natural things, corporeal doctrine and mental doctrine, is only possible by means of mathematics. And as in every natural doctrine, only so much science proper is to be met with thinking as there is cognition a priori. A doctrine of nature can only contain so much science proper as there is in it of applied mathematics." Which is an amazing quote, which I probably read very badly because those periods are as long as fuck. This comes from, if you are interested, from the Metaphysical Foundation of Natural Science, 1786. Now, this also tells us a lot about the question, is math science? And the answer, of course, will be, according to the first definition I've given, no. According to the second definition we've given, absolutely. That's the one, that's the quote. According to the third definition we've given, kinda. That's more complicated. So, what is science really? We've given two definitions, and both of these are valid, and depending on what the heck you're doing, any of these could be perfectly reasonable, but I think that that is not really what we're interested in when we talk about whether history is science or not. And here you might tell, but if that's the case, why did you bother us for 15 minutes about this shit? And it answered that you are right, but I had a lot of fun doing that, so shut the fuck up. If you don't like it, go watch another video. Now, what is science really? I think that the first definition we've given, the one about the scientific method, really tells us something interesting, okay? So, if the status of history as science were to be comparable with the one of mathematics, history would not be science. Let's not fool ourselves. There are definitions according to which math is science, but that's not really what we're talking about. Math is not about concrete physical objects. Math is not about the physical world. Math is mainly a language. Math is a way of expressing logic. And logic is an organon. Logic is a tool. Logic is not science in itself. It is in a certain way, but not really in the same way physics is, not in the same way anthropology is, not in the same way cosmology is. And if you think those last two ain't sciences, go fuck yourself 2.0. Now, so what is really a science? I think that we could call it like this, and I think this definition really works. I think we could say that science is a method of building knowledge that starts from a priori concepts, follows using empirical data, and then using models and specific tools manages to build up paradigmic answers that have the same gnosiological validity as the empirical framework that was tested in. What does this mean? That's super easy. You have some a priori conceptions when you do science, like, cause and effect when you do, anthropology or maybe even history. And then you use those to guide your way, and that's very important, to empirical analysis, which you might do with experiments, you might do somehow else, but empirical analysis guided by conceptions known a priori is what makes science science, together with the awareness that whatever answers it gets ain't universal. They are constrained in a cage of gnosiological limitations. So, does history do that? Well, short answer, yeah. Long answer, yeah. Jokes aside, yeah, I think I do think history does that, and I think there is no doubt whatsoever about that, because we are so used to thinking of history as just expressing facts and telling stuff and just saying this guy did that because of this, and it is that too. History is indeed just going around and understanding why people did something, like understanding why Hitler invaded the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, is doing history, of course, and it might not be clear where the empirical element is there, that it must be understood that history today uses a powerful tool that is born as physics, which is models. History knows today that it cannot hope to go anywhere just analyzing the single fact, the single event in the single frame. It has to know something in general about long-term dynamics. Like, for example, roulette appears the keys to power. That is a general thing, that is a general assumption that history develops. But this assumption does not come from the sky. You do not know it because it makes sense. You know that because you have seen it happen. You have seen, and that's the empirical method, that's the entire point of this video. You have seen in other societies that a lot of what happened could be explained by saying the ruler appeases the keys to power. Gigi made a great video about that, go watch it. And therefore, since in every society you had empirical data to determine whether or not it happened, since that's the case, you conclude that it must be true everywhere. Is that universal? Is that as strict as a mathematical theorem? Nope. But that's empirical evidence. You see an apple fall from a tree and you deduce that most likely all apples fall from trees. You don't know that, you do not know that universally. That's statistics. And that being statistics is the nosological cage we were talking about earlier on. That's the reason, that's the factor that makes science. The fact that it works on empirical assumptions. Okay? And the conclusion it gets to are valid into the nosological framework of the empirical data they were based upon. This said, history, then what it does with that, what does it do with this general assumption, which is not really an assumption, but I'm just going to use that term. It just, but by assuming it's valid every time, when it says that it can explain a single thing that happened, it says it does. And it doesn't stop there. It tries desperately to collect physical evidence of the single case in particular to solidify the claim. And once it does, you have explained something. And you have explained something by using the model, by using the general model. What is the most famous model of the history of history? Well, I think it's Marx's conception of history as made by competing classes and class struggle. There are a lot of people making a lot of fuss about this, and we ain't gonna debunk this in right now. But just think about the way Marx did history. Marx said, basically, I'm not saying that Marx was fully aware of the nosological implications of the way he was working. I'm just saying that they were there, and we should enlighten that. How did Marx work? Marx very basically said society built up a model like what we said earlier. Rulers appease ruler appeases keys to power was a model. Marx built a model, and this model said everything that happens is related to competing classes into a specific economic framework. Okay? He said it was a little bit more complex than that, but it was like in industrial societies, in Western societies, we have two classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie wants to control the proletariat, for the bourgeoisie has the means of production, while the workers, are the workers, and they're both needed to produce and to make the economy work. So both classes, to dominate, to be independent, to be capable of doing whatever they want, would need to have what the other class has. And so the bourgeoisie, which is the class that oppresses the other, which is the more powerful because it has very important means of production, it has basically the wealth, all the wealth is concentrated in their hands, uses their wealth to subjugate and oppress the lower class, and by doing that they force the lower class to give the bourgeoisie their work, their labor, and by doing that, the bourgeoisie has the labor, which it steals, and the means of production, and by doing that, the bourgeoisie have everything. And at that point, all the bourgeoisie does, and all that makes sense to be done by the bourgeoisie, is either aimed to strengthen their economic production or their grip on the lower classes. And so, what should the lower classes do? Well, since the only form of democracy we can have by abolishing classes, because as long as we don't, the upper classes are going to oppress the others. And since since the second best thing, the closest thing to democracy, would basically be making the lower class, the proletariat, be the one to actually dominate, because that's basically everyone does. So a dictatorship of the proletariat, however scary that sounds, is basically democracy, because if everyone is a dictator, so we are in democracy, and basically everyone is a worker or a peasant. Not really everyone. That's because and that's why it's the second best thing. That's the closest thing to democracy, apart from elimination of classes. Because of these things, what the proletariat should do is to kick the bourgeoisie's ass and seize the means of production, and etc. We all know that. This is Marx's model. How did Marx build that? He invented it because it was evil and he wanted to build totalitarianism. No, obviously not, and that is a pretty good model. I mean, there are surely issues there. I've said it before. For Marx, everything can be related to this model, which is pretentious at best. But that is a very good model because we have analyzed a lot of societies, and not in every society, but in those societies that actually create classes. And in Europe, it happened in the Middle Ages. There are people who would say that's not true, but I'd be wrong. Once classes are formed, these dynamics, Marx and Latin, almost always appear. I think that a lot of events of the Middle Ages can be traced to this model. Big example, the heretical movements in Europe, in 14th century Europe, and following that, the way the church, which you should think of as an upper class, reacted to this, trying to suppress heretical movements. You could read that, and I think you should, that's the way I do, as those heretical movements as the way the Middle Ages lower class was saying that they didn't accept the fact that all means of production were concentrated in the hands of the upper class. And what the upper class does, since the upper class always wants to keep his grip on the lower classes' labors, what the upper class does is trying to suppress that. And how does it suppress that? Well, Marx had already understood that a way, and then the Italian philosopher Gramsci developed this even further, a great way to suppress the lower classes, revolutionary tendencies, is for the upper classes to convince them that they are very well under the upper classes' control. And that's exactly what the church did. This model manages to predict what happened after what the model says that should happen to give a certain outcome. Listen, the model made a prediction, the prediction was correct, and therefore we think the model is correct. That is a certain way of working, and that's exactly how we work in physics too. That's exactly what we did with some quantum models during the quantum revolution of the last century. So, but coming back to Marx, we see that this model works because it explains some phenomena. It manages to tell us a lot about heretical movements. Why did all heretical movements develop in that period? Because developed in that period, in that framework exactly. Marx's model answers that. It answers that by pointing to class struggle in the period, which was already very common because of the way different factors had made like a Malthusian cycle of economic, a Malthusian demographic cycle, but that's another story. The way different factors managed to make the value of the lower classes labor oscillate. And Marx model, and that's another thing that it has in common with physics model, has Marx didn't understand that, and that was his biggest mistake, has limits in the sense that it can't be applied every time. Obviously, even when it can be applied, it doesn't explain everything, but it explains a lot of things, and that makes it a quite impressive model, at least in my opinion. But it can be applied just in some conditions, and these conditions ain't always verified, like the Roman Empire. Were there classes in the Roman Empire? That kind of depends on the way you define classes, but in my opinion, every time you talk about a class, you are implying that the class knows its class, that's class awareness. In the Roman Empire, we have evidence that was not the case at all, and therefore there were not classes in the Roman Empire, therefore there was no class struggle, and therefore Marx's model does not apply. That's my opinion on how the Roman Empire evades Marxist analysis of history. But I think that medieval Europe, at least after 1000 AC, doesn't. And the fact that a lot of our historical analysis is based on a model that we've seen it multiple times works exactly like physics model, I think that just tells us that history works according to the definition of science we've given. And that's the reason why I think the answer to the question in this video is yes, and absolutely yes. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you disagree with me, you're wrong, but I want to know why. So well, in the comments, I'll explain to you why you're wrong. And I'm kidding, obviously, but maybe not so much. Like the video, share it with your friends. Please subscribe. I will appreciate it. I don't know if you care, but I'm just gonna assume you do. And see ya to the next time and the next video by the Rerum Natura.